Lunch and coming back. So I'm Matt Blaze. They asked me to give a talk, and they didn't ask me to talk about anything in particular. So I'm going to talk for a little while about not much in particular, but kind of broadly what we've learned as hackers and what we're good at and what we're bad at. And so what I decided to call this is Cryptography and Failure, because we're good at both of those things. And in particular, we've actually gotten pretty good at, doing cryptography. And that's actually something that's changed during, my professional lifetime. We've gone from a world in which we really didn't know what we were doing to a world in which the civilian, non-NSA crypto community, is surprisingly sophisticated and good at what it does, and yet security is probably worse now than it ever was. So somehow we've managed to get good at security and good at failing at the same time. So I'd like to just spend a minute talking about where we fail and giving an example of where we fail. So, we fail in a number of different ways. And probably the most prominent way we look for failure is in algorithms and protocols, right? I mean, we do things like say, oh, well, there's cryptography involved, and there are cryptographic protocols involved, and those are written down really formally, and, let's really look at them carefully and see if there's something wrong with them. And, interestingly, an example of our success is that we sometimes fail there. We sometimes find things that are wrong there, but it's the exception rather than the rule. It's pretty rare to see a cryptographic 0 day in a fielded system. Now when it happens, it's very exciting because it tends to apply to many, many different things. But it's still more the exception than the rule. And so, of course, particularly as an academic, but even as a non-academic researcher, or at least as the sort of person who likes to publish papers, in spite of the fact that that's probably the least fruitful place to look for problems, that's where we spend most of our time. Right? I mean, that's where we reward people for writing papers, and that's where we encourage people to spend all of their time looking for new cryptographic and protocol weaknesses. And it's a lot like that old joke about the guy who's standing on a street corner looking down, and somebody finally comes up to him and says, "What are you looking for? Can I help you?" "Yeah, I'm looking for my keys. I lost them." And where did you lose them? "About 2 blocks down." And well, why are you looking here? "Well, there's that street light. The light is much better here." And we know how to look for problems in crypto protocols, so that's what we do. And it almost never works. But then there's failures of engineering and implementation. And, there we often see failures. And we, that is, we have bugs in software, we have design flaws in systems, and, we have architectural failures of design. And that actually occurs, probably a factor of 10 times more often at least than cryptographic failures, but we don't really know how to formalize it quite as well, right? I mean, we have some notion of correct programming, but it boils down to comparing one program, or maybe the specification of a program, to another program, and actually that's one of the very few things in computer science we can prove we don't know how to do. So it's hard. And it's hard to know whether you've got the specification right in the first place. And so we fail a lot there, but when we fail there, we often get to say, oh, well, whatever went wrong, it was somebody else's fault, and so the system was fine, even though it didn't work. And then finally, we have failures of systems as a whole, and I'm not even sure how to characterize that. And failures of the security provided by a mechanism to match the security that is required by the application. And in fact, almost all of our failures fall into that category. And that category is both the most fruitful to look for vulnerabilities in and the most difficult to even nail down. And so, with that lesson, sort of well learned, and I think anybody who looks for vulnerabilities in systems knows this intuitively and extremely well, we still spend our time looking under the streetlight where the light is, at the crypto algorithms and protocols. So I want to give you an example of where I've been guilty of this in my group, and it may be some work that you're familiar with, but I'm going to go over it very briefly. And then I'll talk about what we can learn from that for some current public policy debates where computer security and cryptography and, the government are smashing into each other head on. So the example that I want to give of a failure, and I'm talking about both a failure in terms of the system and also a failure in terms of the way that we went about analyzing it, was a system that I looked at a couple of years ago with my grad students called Apko Project 25. So Apko Project 25 is this two-way radio standard that was developed in the early 1990s as a successor to something called Apko Project 16. I'm not quite sure I understand their naming scheme all that well. It was intended to basically be a digital drop-in replacement protocol for analog FM narrowband two-way radio used by public safety and similar types of land mobile radio users. So this is a two-way radio system. It was designed in the early 1990s. It really started to take off in the late 1990s, early 2000s. Equipment started to become available for it. And the federal government went kind of wild buying equipment for it. At about the same time that the equipment started to become available and the government started buying it, they started to graft onto it security standards. Because this is digital two-way radio, it's now much easier to add encryption and other kinds of security features to it. In particular, digitizing, once something's digitized, it's just plain old cryptography on digital data. Securing analog voice is much harder, and generally doesn't work all that well, degrades quality. Encryption doesn't degrade quality at all, and it's very straightforward to do because of the layered model that you get with digital communication. This was a heavily constrained problem. In particular, the P25 system is intended to be spectrum compatible with its predecessor. And what that means is that it has to use exactly the same frequency allocation model as analog systems, even though if you've got a digital system, there are all sorts of things you could do that might be more spectrum efficient and more resistant to various kinds of interference, and might work better, things like spread spectrum. You couldn't do that with this system because it was intended to replace the individual narrowband channels that carried voice over the analog systems that it was intended to replace, and had to in fact be able to coexist with those systems. They couldn't just, this would be like changing, okay, everybody all at once stop using IP. We can't really do that. We have to come up with something that's incrementally compatible. Okay, so how does this work? Well, the channels have to fit into a narrowband channel. That's a 12.5 kilohertz wide allocation of spectrum that has to carry voice. And so that's the same bandwidth of a standard analog voice channel for land mobile radio. Now, that basically means you can fit comfortably about 9,600 bits per second into that channel over the constraints of radio. And they do that with an encoding, a baud encoding 4,800 2-bit symbols per second that they send. And the voice is encoded using a standard vocoder called IMBE that gives actually surprisingly reasonable speech quality at that bit rate. It's pretty good, sort of telephone quality, or maybe a little bit worse than telephone quality audio. Sounds a little bit different than analog FM, but it's still pretty good. And it's actually fairly computationally intensive and generally needs specialized hardware to implement just the vocoder itself and the decoding. The vocoder divides speech up into 180 millisecond long frames, and if you do the division, that's 1728 bits per 180 millisecond frame that are sent out one after the other. So a stream of a voice stream basically consists of these 180 millisecond, 1728 bit chunks of data sent in a train one after the other. And there are a couple of details here. There are two different kinds of these frames, but they that carry different metadata in each. But each of those frames basically contains the bulk of those 1728 bits are IMBE encoded voice, and then and that might or might not be encrypted. And then the rest of it, a few other bits, are metadata basically saying, hey, this is the type of frame it is. It's a voice frame. It's encrypted or it's not encrypted. Here's the unit ID that's being sent, and so on, so that the receiver can receive it. Now, the one thing that's important to remember is that this is digital communication, but it's a digital communication that is very different from the vast majority of protocols that we design for things like the Internet. In particular, although this is intended for something that is ostensibly called two-way radio, it's in fact a almost completely one-way protocol. The transmitter is broadcasting, and receivers are entirely passive. So there are no acknowledgments that are sent back, or any notion of a session in the same way that we tend to design protocols and we tend to analyze protocols. This is the transmitter puts stuff out over the air, and it is entirely up to the receiver to be able to receive it. Now, another property is this is going over radio. Now, with wireline digital protocols, we tend to have an error property where it's pretty much either all or nothing. You've either corrupted your packet or your frame or what have you, or it has gotten through completely perfectly. And what we tend to do is design protocols where the model is either accept completely or reject completely. In fact, over a radio protocol, that would work horribly, because the nature of radio is there are little transient fades and multipath transmission and things that'll cause, a few of the bits to get corrupted with very high probability on almost every transmission. So this has to tolerate, low-grade errors without without just stopping completely, because low-grade errors are just really normal. Right? A non-zero bit error rate is normal. So it makes heavy use of forward error correction, which is to say the vocoder itself can tolerate some dropped bits. The more dropped bits there are, the lower the quality of the audio. But if you kill 10% of the bits, it'll still sound pretty recognizable. So that's an important property. And the metadata that's used when you decode these frames also is forward error corrected, so that if a few of those bits are corrupted, you can recover what the actual payload bits are of the metadata. And in fact, there are about 64 bits of important metadata in each of them in a couple of different frames that are each error corrected. Okay, so we analyzed this protocol, my graduate students and I, because we were bored, basically. We got some grant money to look at GSM and other mobile cellular phones, and we discovered that the equipment wasn't quite available that we needed. And so what are we going to do? Well, we decided, well, let's look at some other protocol and hope that they don't notice that we didn't look at the one that they paid us to look for. And, this is radio. It's sort of the same. Nobody will care. So I hope no one's from NSF here. So what did we do? Well, we looked at the protocols, and we did that by getting copies of the standards, which we had to get by interlibrary loan from Canada, because they charged so much for the standards we couldn't actually afford to buy them. It would have killed our entire budget, but we found a library in Canada that was willing to lend them to us. And we looked at the standards, and our first reaction was, oh my God, the security standards for this look as if somebody from the NSA showed up at the first meeting and then stopped showing up. Because it had all of this sort of good terminology, things like they talked about key material and crypto variables and all this sort of fairly NSA spooky looking terminology. And then almost every actual cryptographic decision that they made was unbelievably bad. Like not unbelievably bad like some subtle secret backdoor bad, but unbelievably bad like the security guy isn't here, what do we do? Oh, well, let's just keep going. And it turned out that's actually what happened. So we found actually numerous weaknesses in the protocols. So first of all, everything is unauthenticated, even if you've got key material, which, among other things, means that parts of the protocol are vulnerable to replay attacks. And there's, in particular, a sub-protocol of it called over-the-air ReKeying that becomes extremely vulnerable because of this. And there's a very slightly clever replay that you can do that'll wipe people's keys out remotely. And it's just like you look at the standard and it becomes immediately obvious what it is. Metadata is not encrypted, and that includes unique unit identifiers and, when the option is turned on, their location. And this appears to have just been an error in the specification, because they're attempting to do this. It says that this is one of the requirements, but then they just don't actually encrypt any of the metadata. And what that means is that if people have location services turned on, an adversary can basically create a map of where everyone is in a system, even if they can't decrypt the voice. So if you've seen the Harry Potter movies, which, by the way, I haven't, but my students tell me, this is just like the Marauders map that you can create from Harry Potter, where you see where your adversary is at all time. So when the surveillance people are following you around, you can see where they are. And we discovered a remarkably terrible susceptibility to denial of service because of the way the framing is arranged. So in particular, I'm going to talk very briefly about that, because that was probably the most, that was where most of the light that we applied was to this protocol. And basically, there's aggressive forward error correcting, but they don't forward or error correct that entire 1728-bit frame. Instead, they forward error correct individual fields. So each individual field of that frame is separately error corrected. And, why is that good or why is that bad? Well, it's good in the sense that you can apply different types of error correction to different parts of the frame, and that might be a little more bit efficient. But it means also that an adversary can select an individual subfield to jam if they've got good timing synchronization. They can just pick out an individual field and block it out and not bother blotting out other fields if they only care about jamming one of them. Well, one of those fields is a 64-bit field that actually contains 16 bits of payload that identifies the type of frame. And in particular, it identifies, is this encrypted? Is this in the clear? Is this a voice frame? And that 64 bits out of those 728 bits is essential for the receiver to be able to demodulate the rest of the frame. If they don't have those 64 bits, they can't do anything with the rest of the 1728 bits. And so what that means is that if a jammer has good timing synchronization and turns on their jamming transmitter for 64 bits out of the 1728 bits, which they can helpfully do because it comes right after a synchronization field in the frame. So it's very easy to build a piece of equipment that does this timing, or at least in principle it should be. They can essentially achieve something that is, kind of unprecedented in the history of jamming. The way you identify the jamming resistance of a radio system is by comparing the energy required by the jammer to the energy required by the user. And if you do nothing, and you just design a kind of dumb protocol, it's roughly 50-50. Whoever has the most energy wins. If you're designing a system to resist jamming, you want to make the jammer use a large amount more energy than the system that they're trying to jam. So maybe 10 or 20 dB more at a minimum. And things like spread spectrum achieve that in different ways, particularly if they keep the spreading sequence in an encrypted way. So you can actually achieve really good resistance from an energy comparison to jamming. And again, if you do nothing, it's just the strongest wins. Might makes right. But this protocol manages to go exactly backwards because of this ability to jam individual subfields. The jammer actually enjoys a 14 decibel by power advantage because they only have to turn on their jamming transmitter in short bursts. And what that means is that, with a couple of AA batteries worth of energy, you can build a fairly powerful jammer that'll last for days and days against a fairly high-powered system in principle. Okay, so why is that bad? Well, jamming systems is bad, particularly jamming systems that are used for public safety and surveillance and by the Secret Service and the FBI and all of those things. But in particular, you can interact with the security part of the protocol in really mean ways if you do this. So the scenario that we thought of was very selective jamming. Teach the users that the encryption doesn't work, and do that by only jamming encrypted transmissions so that they learn to turn off their encryption in order for the messages to get through. That might be an interesting scenario in which the encryption works, but it doesn't actually work for the users, and so they're forced to turn it off. And again, fortunately, the part that says this is an encrypted transmission comes right before the part that you have to actually jam. So again, you could build a jammer that synchronizes and recognizes this very easily. Okay, so how hard is this to do in practice? So one of my grad students at the time, a fellow by the name of Travis Goodspeed, who I'm sure you all know, he is probably the most dangerous person I've ever had in my lab in all respects, because he kept ordering all these dangerous chemicals. Like, they stopped accepting his packages in the mailroom because of all the scary stickers that were on them. And he kept saying, hey, can I use a fume hood? And I said, well, I don't have a fume hood. And he says, okay, never mind. And then, he's doing this stuff in the lab with smoke, and then things start corroding. So Travis said, oh, I know how to build one of these. Okay, and I'm thinking, oh God, what's it going to cost? We're going to actually build this high synchronization radio equipment. He said, oh no, there's this thing, here, it's called an IM-Me, which was a toy marketed at preteen girls in the early 2000s that has a chipset in it that turns out to be exactly compatible with the way the P25 transmissions are framed. And of course, it has a little JTAG interface inside it. If you solder some pins to it, you can reprogram this chip to build the little recognizer to synchronize frames and turn on. And it conveniently takes not 2, but 3 AA batteries, and can, if you soup it up, put out about 800 milliwatts of power. But if you do it in really short bursts, you can get it to even more than that. And they turn out to be really cheap because the service they use went out of business. So they're kind of useless for their original purpose, and you could just buy these things for about $8 each on eBay. The chip itself would have cost about $25 each, so it was cheaper to buy it in this little pink box than it was to do it. So we bought a whole bunch of them and programmed them to do that, and that developed this sort of nice proof of concept. We built the My First Jammer. So we were very proud of ourselves, and we did what we do as academics, which was not deploy these around the city and go on a bank robbery spree, but we wrote a paper. But before we wrote the paper, we wanted to know, hey, we're smart, but we're not the only smart people around. Have bad guys figured this out too? Are people actually deploying this? And so we decided to build a network of receivers to monitor over-the-air sensitive P25 transmissions, like of the FBI and the State Department and the Secret Service and all of these agencies, to see if we could recognize the attack packets that we were sending out, to see if, has somebody else figured this out? Are they doing this to these people? And it turned out that, in fact, to make a long story short, it was easy to identify the frequencies that they're using for sensitive stuff, because they're the ones with encrypted traffic on it. And it turns out there's also redundant metadata that they use, like you can tell which agency is using it from the unit IDs that they're doing, and it took us a little exercise in traffic analysis to figure out how to reliably identify who was transmitting on what channel, but we figured out, okay, this is the Secret Service, this is the State Department, this is just the post office, and so on. And then we said, okay, well, let's record this stuff. And then, as we're configuring it, we notice that we're getting on these encrypted channels a whole bunch of clear traffic. And we're doing some investigation and think, aha, somebody had scooped us and is doing exactly the stuff that we had discovered. Wow, that's really something. There was a 0-day out there in this protocol. But no, we couldn't actually find any evidence of any malicious activity. We would just see all this clear traffic on these otherwise encrypted channels. And it turns out that none of the attacks turned out to actually be necessary. There was no need to bother with any looking where the light was and analyzing this protocol. So in 1995, I attended a conference that I go to called Crypto. It's the conference for cryptographers. It's held in Santa Barbara every August. It's very nice. It's right on the beach. So the cryptographers basically have this week-long party. They had invited as their keynote speaker in 1995 one of the head cryptographers at the National Security Agency, a fellow by the name of Bob Morris. He's the father of another Robert Morris that you may have heard of. And he worked at NSA, and he promised at the beginning of his talk that he was going to reveal the NSA's first rule of cryptanalysis. And so I made sure, okay, it's worth getting up early and going to this talk. I want to learn the NSA's first rule of cryptanalysis. That might be useful. I'm kind of surprised he's revealing it. I'll bet it's really good. He's going to say something like, use Gaussian elimination on the S boxes or something like that. And then you get the clear text. So he said, okay, rule 1 of cryptanalysis, and it's very important because it works about 50% of the time. Rule 1 of cryptanalysis, look for clear text. And that was it. We did that, with this, P25 system. So we basically found all of the channels that they were using, configured a network of receivers in a number of metropolitan areas, Philly obviously being one, but other large metropolitan areas that you can imagine. That basically everywhere we had friends. We said, hey, can you put this box in your apartment? No, don't ask any questions. Put the antenna near the window. And had it upload every night everything that it got on the sensitive government channels. And we also checked with our lawyers to make sure it was legal. It turns out it is, amazingly. So what we discovered was that, in fact, on the channels that have sensitive traffic that are encrypted, mostly they're encrypted. But on average, there's about 30 minutes a day of just out of the blue clear transmission that just starts at some point and then it goes back to being encrypted after a while. Or some fraction of users just don't have encryption turned on. And we're trying to figure out what on earth is going on here. And some of the sensitive stuff, I mean like really sensitive. Things like, all right, I have the informant in the car, except they say CI because it sounds cooler. I have the informant in the car with me. He's the guy in the green shirt. Information that might be kind of useful if you're the target of that investigation. The sensitive traffic used, when they're doing executive protection of the, people like the president and so on, just, goes out in the clear. Interestingly, the agency, we discovered sensitive traffic from every agency we had heard of, plus a few agencies that we hadn't heard of, that we tracked down. But one agency never, ever transmitted any clear traffic. They were always 100% encrypted. And, you're thinking, well, who would that agency be? Obviously the NSA. No, actually the NSA security forces, they're in the clear all the time around Fort Meade. The postal inspector. Yeah. Don't mess with the postal inspector. They understand crypto. So I ended up actually talking to the postal inspector's information tech guy, and he said, yeah, basically there was this guy, he retired, he just drilled this into everybody to get the crypto right. But almost everybody else sends traffic in the clear, and it was just completely inexplicable. So why? Well, so what we discovered was that a frequent problem, and we did this by analyzing first metadata and then by actually just listening to the transmission. It was frequently the case that different users within a network didn't have the same keys. Keys would be identified, so you could tell this by analyzing the metadata pretty easily. That the key identifiers would sometimes just get out of sync. And the only way to resolve that, if you don't have the keys, is to turn the radio into the clear mode. And so it turns out there's a protocol for over-the-air ReKeying that the federal government uses every month for most agencies and every week for the really sensitive ones, in which radios are sent new keys. And the new keys erase the old keys. And this is done radio by radio. And so if you're not in range with your radio at the time that the over-the-air ReKeying broadcast happens, and you forget to request new keys be sent to you, your radio won't have, with high probability, will have the old keys in it, but your colleagues' radios will have the new keys in them. And so this protocol intended to keep keys up to date, in fact, helps ensure that keys won't stay up to date because of the way this actually works. It's not a synchronized protocol where everybody updates at the same time. It's done radio by radio. And so, ironically, if you're one of the really sensitive agencies, where you're ReKeying every week, it's much higher probability that you're going to actually end up in the clear, because people don't have the same key material. So that seemed to account for about half of the clear traffic that we saw. In fact, anytime we'd see an over-the-air ReKeying transmission happen, we'd say, oh boy, we're about to see a bunch of clear text. And that would last for, a few days or sometimes weeks before it would go back to being more encrypted than it was. So, we learned, first Wednesday of the month, time to listen for some clear text. That was yesterday. That was the day before yesterday, by the way. The other thing is that their users don't actually know how to turn the crypto on and off. And you could say, well, that's the user's fault. But I think we can call this a pretty good usability failure. So let me just give an example of the user interface for these radios. So this is a Motorola XTS 5000 radio, which is probably the most common of these radios used by the federal government. It's a expensive walkie-talkie. It's roughly like a brick. It's very well built. You could hurt somebody with it. This is what it looks like in its user interface. There's the top of the radio, and there's its front panel display. It's a walkie-talkie radio. You hold it up to your face. This is what it looks like when it's configured in the clear mode, and this is what it looks like when it's configured in the secure mode. And the difference, you might notice, is there's this little switch on the top of the radio next to the antenna, and it's kind of hard to see, but you see there's a little, like, null symbol and a 0 symbol. And that's actually a rotating switch that can go from one position to the other. And one of them means encrypted, and the other means clear. And helpfully, they also show that logo in the middle of the display. Now, you can't actually see that display when you're using the radio because it's right in front of your nose. That's how it shows whether it's encrypted or clear. So we noticed that in listening to, we'd listened to some of these transmissions. It was great because it was like having our own private version of The Wire. We'd hear these little surveillance operations that were going on. We would often hear the very first thing is, "Okay, I'm in secure mode," and quite plainly, no, they're not. And then sometimes you have somebody explaining to somebody else, "No, to get it in secure mode, you have to put it to the little circle. The circle with the line turns the encryption off," which is a perfectly, valid guess. But it's interesting. You could kind of make the argument either way. Well, one is closed and the other is open, maybe, and that seems to be the metaphor that they were going to. But it could be off and on, which is sort of the opposite way to do it. And there's widespread disagreement about what these symbols mean. But the manufacturer, in this case Motorola, thinks that this is what the secure mode should look like. And so basically we discovered some incredibly subtle cryptographic failures, and we had Travis do some great electrical engineering work in making this thing get all synchronized in order to force them to go into the clear. But it turns out that they would go into the clear without our help. It was just really easy to do. Okay, so where does that lead? Well, this suggests this is a failure at the systems level. This had failures a little bit at the cryptography level, more at the implementation level, but completely at the systems level. This suggests we aren't good at building systems to do complex things like this. And in particular, I went to the standards group that put this together. I went to the federal government and talked to them, and they were very friendly and concerned about it. And then then they said, you should talk to these people in the P25 security group. And I went there, and it was absolutely the most hostile group. I was lucky to get out with my life. They basically said, "You don't understand why there's nothing wrong with this system." Was kind of the thing that they spent a couple hours yelling at me and explaining, you don't understand decibels, you don't understand radio, this system is fine. This was before that cartoon with the dog and the flames was out, but that's now what I think of. Okay, so the lesson from this is that building actual complex systems that are in fact reliably secure is actually a really hard thing to do. We could laugh at the designers of this, but they have a point when they say every component of the system can point to some other component as the cause of the failure. Nobody, there's no one thing wrong with this. It's wrong it's wrong in combination, even when the components are actually pretty strong. So where does that leave us? And I'm just going to spend a quick 5 minutes, and then you can yell at me and explain why I don't understand decibels. But I want to spend a quick 5 minutes talking about the sort of current public policy debate and what this sort of thing might tell us about that. So in 1992, AT&T introduced this device called the TSD3600, which was a telephone security device. It was basically a phone encryptor that would work on a wireline phone. $1,400 a piece. They announced this product would use DES and Diffie-Hellman key exchange and display a hash of the key on the phone. It was actually a very clever design, but $1,400, and you'd need 2 of them to encrypt your call. They sold just about as many of them as you could imagine. The federal government, though, caught wind of this and utterly freaked out. They were worried that this would cause wiretaps to become obsolete, that criminals would buy these, and that wiretapping capability would go away. So they convinced AT&T to take out the DES chip that was built into it and replace it with a new chip called Clipper. And Clipper basically introduced a system called key escrow that would send an encrypted copy of the session key as part of the initialization vector that you would send during the key exchange. The decryption key for that encrypted session key would be held in escrow by the government, so that if there was a wiretap order against somebody who was using one of these, they could recover the session key by getting the key out of escrow. And so that was controversial and got much more attention than this phone would have otherwise gotten. At this price. The government, by the way, agreed to buy a whole bunch of these in exchange for AT&T's redesign. And those phones ended up sitting in a warehouse somewhere and then got released as government surplus, and you can buy them for about $40 right now. Clipper had problems. I had actually discovered some of the problems in it, and that killed off this particular idea. But we spent the 1990s arguing with the government about whether this idea broadly was a good idea. And by 2000, the government basically gave up. And it said, you know, actually encryption is important. We want to encourage the community to encrypt things because that is a national security issue. And this key escrow stuff is not going anywhere. Go forth and encrypt. We will get out of this. And, you know, the crypto war ended in about 2000. They got rid of most of the export restrictions on encrypted products, and we lived happily ever after. Until Crypto War II. We didn't know to number the first crypto war, but we are now in Crypto War II. Which started in about 2011 or so, about 5 years ago. It's summarized by FBI Director Comey, who, this is a typical quote from congressional testimony. The law is not keeping up with technology. Those charged with protecting people aren't always able to access evidence when we need it to prosecute crime and prevent terrorism, even with lawful authority. We often lack the technical capability to do so. And this has been a recurring theme. They call it going dark. And interestingly, this is fairly alarmist wording from 2014. If you look at the wiretap report from 2014 that lists, from 2015 that lists when encryption has been encountered in legal wiretaps, in 2014 there were a total of 22 cases, and in 2 of them, officials were unable to get the plain text. So this actually doesn't seem to be as large a problem. If you look at the federal government, you had another 2 cases. So there have been a total of 4 cases of encryption being encountered in wiretaps. But we can, let's be optimistic and assume that that's just because we haven't figured out how to deploy crypto enough yet. And that eventually we will succeed at deploying crypto. Okay, so what do we do? Well, what they've advocated for is basically a return to key escrow. And, I think we can take some of the lessons of failure that we've got to analyze whether or not key escrow style backdoors are likely to prevent crime or cause crime. And I think you can make an argument that backdoors are both dangerous, that is, they make crypto systems weaker, and also ineffective. And I think it is probably unarguable, and I'm going to use the C word for just once, and because you're allowed to use it in Washington. We are in a national cybersecurity crisis, which is, and I think that's unarguably true, unarguably the case. We are seeing more data breaches than ever before. We are seeing systems failing left and right. And, our ability to secure systems seems to be outpaced by our ability to build weak systems. Every time we take one step forward and two steps backwards with progress we're making, and there's really no end in sight to this. We actually really only have two proven tools that can help secure complex systems like we use for our infrastructure. One of those tools is crypto, because that means we have to trust fewer components. And we actually know how to do crypto reasonably well. And the other is make systems as simple as possible. And we're terrible at doing that, but when we are able to do it, we know that it gives us a pretty good chance of working. And unfortunately, the backdoor concept makes systems more complex, so it attacks our ability to make them simple, and it also attacks the crypto by, in particular, making the crypto more complex and increasing its attack surface. So the backdoor concept attacks head-on really the only two security mechanisms we have that have a proven track record of success in real systems. And worse, backdoors are easily evaded, right? I mean, crypto software is available. There's this thing called the internet, and you can download software on it. People even write books and teach classes about how to do these things. The secret is out. And so if we mandate that, Apple and Microsoft and so on, incorporate these mechanisms, building encryption on top of that doesn't have the backdoor would be a fairly straightforward thing to do. So we're stuck with these two potentially unreconcilable problems. The first is we can't afford more security vulnerabilities, and lawful access either is or will be getting harder. And that is where we are today, in a world in which we are doing a terrible job securing our systems, and the only people who seem to think that computer security is actually too good are at the FBI. So with that, thanks very much for coming back from lunch. And I think I think I have a couple minutes. You can yell at me, or yeah. Yeah, it was, well, the people who did the over-the-air radio stuff and the people who did the security were different people, and it was a bit bolted. The standard was deployed with the idea that there would be hooks to do security in it. And, so, it wasn't inherently as bad as that sounds. But literally, when I went to the meeting, I said, the standard looks as if somebody from the NSA showed up for the first couple meetings and then stopped showing up. And it said, oh yeah. That was Roger. He died, and they never replaced him. So I mean, literally, the assumption that I made turned out to be exactly right. So yeah. It would be shocking to me, and who's Big Brother, right? The nice thing about Big Brothers is that, there are so many people with Big Brothers out there. So, if you trust, one, that doesn't mean you should be trusting all of them. And, don't get me started on the certification mess that we're in. Yeah. Okay. Well, anyway, thanks very much. And, see you soon.